Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about the Pentateuch and Old Testament theology. We'll also, in the next lecture, be talking about the former prophets in Old Testament theology. We're not going to get into a lot of the details of historical background, authorship, that sort of thing. House deals with some of that in his Old Testament theology, and you'll need to just go take a look at an Old Testament introduction or perhaps a commentary to dive into those background issues. The purpose of our course is to focus more on the theology of these books, how they fit into the canon of Scripture, and how they tell one coherent story. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. In this particular video lecture, we'll be talking about the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. In the Hebrew Bible, this is referred to as the Torah, the law, and it's because there's lots of law in it, namely from Exodus 20 all the way to Numbers 10. It's all law. And then, of course, in Deuteronomy, large swaths of the middle of Deuteronomy are repetitions of the laws that you read about in Exodus 20 through Numbers 10. So the Jews refer to this as the Torah, the law. But what we're going to see here is that that law is situated in the context of a story. The Pentateuch tells the story of the beginning of the world, but also the beginning of the nation of Israel. And so when we talk about the Torah, we're talking about the law, but the law that's set in the context of the story of the people of God. So we start with Genesis. I'm not going to do what we did last week or 2 weeks ago with the story of the Bible lecture. You've already watched that, hopefully understood it. Much of this material on this particular slide is sort of rehashing what we went over in that particular lecture. So just as a sort of a refresher, Genesis 1, God makes everything. He makes Adam and Eve to dwell in the garden with him as their king. He gives them a rule to obey. He tells them to be fruitful and multiply. He tells them to cultivate and keep the garden. And so that is the vision, God's purpose for humanity. Genesis 2, of course, I just had twins 2.5 weeks ago, so you're going to have to excuse some of the yawns. Genesis 2 continues this picture, brings to bear the idea of image-bearing, particularly showing us that image-bearing is relational and also functional in that we are supposed to go and be fruitful and multiply, care and keep God's creation and obey. And then, of course, everything goes wrong in Genesis 3, namely because Eve and Adam fall prey to the ultimate sin, that of idolatry. They lust after something other than, well, you're not supposed to, lust after God, but they want to find happiness. They want to find fulfillment in something other than the God of the universe. And this has a number of consequences that I mentioned in that story of the Bible lecture, namely that the relationship between God and his creation is affected. So Adam and Eve are now subject to the penalty of death. Their sin separates them from God. They are separated from one another. So they, Eve wants to rule over Adam, and Adam blames Eve. So the relationship between human beings is affected, and then the relationship between human beings and God's creation is affected. The ground is cursed. Adam toils as he struggles to do what he's supposed to do, namely care for the garden, and they're cast out. So they don't obey, they don't rule over the garden, and the effects of that is they're separated from God, from each other, and from creation. And in Genesis 3:15, God embarks on a rescue mission. He promises to rescue Adam and Eve from their sin. And the rest of Genesis is this search for the seed who will crush the head of the serpent. So this really, it's important to, and I know we went over all this in the previous lecture, but it's important to remember this and to really drive it home that Genesis, by placing Genesis in the story of creation, the story of Adam and Eve, at the very beginning of his book, what Moses is doing is setting everything else that happens in the Pentateuch in this particular context. It is in the context of this story. The story of creation, the story of what God intends to do with his creation. That the later story of Israel and then the law, that's the context for those stories. And so as we read through Genesis and as we talk through it here for just a few moments, I want you to remember that the context of the rest of the Bible really is this creation story. Creation and fall, and then the promise of redemption. That is what Yahweh is after in promising this seed of woman. He is promising redemption from the curse of the fall that affected all of his creation that was very good in the beginning. So, from Genesis 4, I think my video may be in the way here, so let me just move myself up. There we go. Starting in Genesis 4, we get this search for the seed. And everything goes downhill very rapidly, basically. Chapter 4 shows that it's going to be impossible for an offspring of Adam to be the seed. Cain and Abel is a heightening of all of the things that went wrong in Genesis 3. So sin is not slowly creeping in to the rest of humanity, but is working at an alarming rate, as we see in Cain's complete possession by sin. So Genesis 4 gives us humanity under the microscope. The Old Testament gives us humanity under a microscope, and what we see is total disobedience, total refusal to obey. We saw it with Adam and Eve, and now we see it sort of on a grander scale with Cain and Abel. We continue to see it with Lamech, and then by the time we get to Genesis 6 and Noah, all of humanity is already, that's 3 chapters, already totally disobedient. And when we get to Genesis 6, what we see is that God saves a remnant. So Noah and his family, God saves a remnant from destruction. Sin, its effects, and its source all have to be destroyed. And so God sends the flood over the entire earth, and what that says is that, again, sin and its effects and its source all have to be destroyed, but that God is also about saving a remnant, saving his creation through Noah. And he doesn't just, this is important, he doesn't just save the human beings, he doesn't just save Noah and his family, and then totally, sort of Death Star the whole world through the water, where it's annihilated and he has to recreate it. What happens is he destroys sin and its effects, and then it's a new creation. So in the destruction of sin, even in the destruction of the physical creation, not annihilation but destruction, God is redeeming creation. He redeems it and saves it. And so with Noah, what we see is he becomes a new Adam. He's placed in the land at the end of the Ark episode. He rightly worships God through the covenantal sacrifice. God makes a covenant with him, much like we made with Adam, and then the whole creation is restored. And Noah is told, "Be fruitful and multiply," multiple times. So he's given the same command as Adam and Eve. So what we see with Noah is that God's purpose, and Noah is from the line of the seed. He he is from the line of Seth. What we see with Noah is that God's purpose for salvation is not just to save human souls. It is to save his entire creation. Now, in doing so, he is saving human beings. But he has a larger purpose in mind, a more robust purpose of salvation, which is to restore what was lost in the fall. He puts Adam in a garden, tells him to be fruitful and multiply, rule over the land, and obey his rules. Adam doesn't do it. He saves Noah from destruction and puts him in the land, tells him, be fruitful and multiply, tells him to rule over the land, and gives him a rule to obey. Well, guess what? Noah also fails. Adam fails, Noah fails. Noah gets drunk, naked in his tent, and where Ham discovers him, and he's obviously not the seed. So just let's go back here. We're searching for the seed. Noah isn't the seed. He's a picture of the seed. He leads his family into the safety of the ark, saving them from destruction. He's told to be fruitful and multiply. He's a picture of redemption, but he is not the Redeemer. And so once again, we're left with, what do we do now? And once again, we're also left with all of humanity is totally depraved, because after Noah's 3 sons have kids, and they have kids, etc., what happens is the Tower of Babel. And so by the end of Genesis 11, you've had Cain and Lamech, then you've had Noah in the flood, and now you get the Tower of Babel, and it's just like, okay, we're done. Humanity is literally done. They cannot obey. They worship idols. They worship themselves. And there is no Redeemer to save them. But God is a Redeemer, and God redeems them through the family of Abraham. He promises through the family of Abraham that he will save humanity from their sin. And this is what happens in Genesis 12. God calls Abram, out of Ur, and he tells Abram to go to the land that God is going to show him. He tells him to bring leave all of his family, leave his land, bring his family and come, and that he's going to make him into a great nation, etc. I'm going to have to speed up here. We've already seen most of this in the story of the Bible, but I want you to just grasp this, that what's happening in the beginning of Genesis is that God is choosing to redeem the world from its own depravity through the family of Abraham. And in the Abrahamic covenant, we already went over this, in the Abrahamic covenant, God is promising to restore what was lost in the fall. He promises Abraham that he's going to give him many descendants. He promises Abraham that he's going to give him a land. He promises Abraham that people will rule over the land from his line. He promises Abraham that he's going to give him rules to obey. All of this is restoring what was lost by Adam and Eve in the garden. The covenant with Abraham is restoring creation. So vital for us to get for Old Testament theology. And for an understanding of soteriology. For you to understand the doctrine of salvation, you have to understand that what God is about in salvation is restoring what was lost with Adam and Eve. He's not just about rescuing sinners from the penalty of hell, although he is about that, and he does that. He's about restoring all that was lost with Adam. And so with Abraham, what we get is a restoration of what was lost with Adam. And the promises to Abraham are about restoring what was lost to Abraham, or lost to Adam. So when we read through Genesis, what we see is this sort of twofold narrative. We continue to see God's redemption of the world progressing through the line of Abraham. So there's this one narrative of the story of the seed that keeps progressing through the Old Testament. And right now, it's gone from seed of Adam to son of Noah, particularly son of Shem, And now it's to a son of Abraham, an Israelite. Later on, will they be called? And so that's one thread of the story that's happening in Genesis and the Pentateuch. The other thread, though, is this continued thread of humanity can't obey. Adam couldn't obey, Cain couldn't obey, Noah couldn't obey, and now Abraham can't obey either. If you read through Genesis 12 through 24, Abraham messes up a bunch. He takes Sarah down to Egypt twice and tries to sell her off to the king twice. His faith is lacking many times. And it's only when God graciously gives him faith that he has it. And it's only God who redeems Abraham. Abraham isn't the Redeemer. It's through Abraham that the Redeemer will come, but Abraham isn't it. And so you have these two threads weaving throughout Genesis. The one thread of the redemption promised by God through the line of Abraham, but the other thread saying nobody, no human being can obey. And so those two threads are running throughout. So we get to Isaac and his sons, and there's a sort of a similar pattern here. Isaac to Jacob, neither of them can obey. Jacob particularly is a great example of disobedience. And then we get to Jacob and his 12 sons, who become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the one we want to focus on here is Joseph. Joseph in chapters 37 through 50. And I think I mentioned this in a different lecture, but Joseph is introduced. And let's just go over for a minute how he's painted in Genesis. He's introduced in 37, and then we have the story of Judah and Tamar in 38. And then 39 through 50 are about Joseph. And Joseph, Joseph is presented as this new Adam figure. He is presented like Adam. And when we see Joseph, he is able. Let's sort of go big picture here. He's able to discern between good and evil. So in the dreams that the Pharaoh can't understand, Joseph understands as a discernment between good crops and bad crops, and good crops and good animals and sick animals. And when those terms good and bad are used in Genesis 37 through 50 about these dreams, they're the same Hebrew words as we find in Genesis 2 about not eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So Adam was unable to discern between good and evil, but Joseph is. Joseph can discern between good and evil. Joseph is placed as second in command only to the king. He is given rule over the land. He is the king's vice regent. He rules for the king. Much like Adam is placed over the land as Yahweh's vice regent. Joseph is clothed in the image of the king. He's given a signet ring and a cloak that are similar to the Pharaoh's, much like Adam is clothed in the image of God. Joseph is given a wife by Pharaoh, by the king, much like Adam is given a wife by the king, Yahweh. And Joseph's name, Yasaf, the verb in Hebrew, is a verb that means number, to number. So it's not the same verb as be fruitful and multiply, but it's close. It's sort of a cognitive parallel. Number, multiply. And Joseph, at the end of the story, he numbers. He multiplies. He has kids. And so Joseph is presented as this new Adam figure. He rules over the land as the vice regent of the king. He's clothed in the image of the king. He's given a wife by the king, and he multiplies, much like Adam was supposed to do. The problem is that when we get to Genesis 49, Joseph isn't the seed. It's Judah. Judah isn't the seed, but he's the one through whom the seed will come. It's through Judah's family, through prostitution, through sleeping with your daughter-in-law, that the seed comes. And that's what happens with Genesis 38. We get introduced to this great story of Joseph that is this picture of redemption. But Joseph isn't the seed. Judah is. It's through Judah's line that the seed will come. We get a similar, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we get a similar sort of genealogy with Moses. Moses is not from the line of Judah. And that's said up front. Moses is not from the line of Judah, but we have all this language of Moses being like a new Noah. For instance, in Exodus 3, the story of Moses in the basket in the river, that's all Noah language. So Joseph is not the seed, but he is the picture of the seed. I mean, Joseph doesn't destroy the serpent. He doesn't crush the serpent under his head like was promised in Genesis 3:15. So that's the obvious issue. He also doesn't rule over the land that was promised to Abraham, namely the land of Israel. He was ruling over part of Egypt. So he doesn't deal with the sin problem, and he doesn't fulfill all the promises made to Abraham. But he's still a picture of redemption. He's a picture of the Redeemer. He is a new Adam who is not the new Adam. Okay, so as you think about the story of Joseph, you want to think about how he pictures Christ but isn't Christ. And I just gave you some of those ways. I'm looking over your quiz questions just to make sure I've covered everything here. Let me just pause and say about that. You want to make sure that you're reading the textbooks before you take the quizzes. I've pulled quiz questions from the Bible content. I've pulled quiz questions from your reading, and I've pulled quiz questions from the lectures. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're not just watching the lectures, but that you're doing the reading and familiar with the Bible content. Okay. So let's move on to Exodus. 430 years after Abraham, Israel is oppressed by the Egyptians. Joseph has died. The other patriarchs of Israel, Jacob's other sons, have died. And a new Pharaoh is king, and he has oppressed Israel. The Exodus is crucial because it is the model of salvation for the Old Testament. If you want to talk about how the Israelites talk about salvation, it's Exodus language. That's it. God's people here are in bondage. In order to save them, he sends tribulation. It's a sign of his judgment on the oppressors, but also a means of his people's rescue. He sends his prophet to free his people. He demands the death of the firstborn son. He covers his wrath in the blood of a lamb. Man, you can't get excited about that. This is the Old Testament model of how God redeems his people. And when we look to the New Testament, we see Jesus frees his people from bondage. Jesus experienced tribulation for us. And it's also a sign of judgment for those who don't believe. Jesus is the prophet greater than Moses. Jesus is God's own firstborn son who goes to death for us. And Jesus is the Lamb who is slain, who, when we are covered with his blood, are freed. That'll preach. A few things about this story that we want to talk about before we jump into the law. So let me just expand on a couple of points here. First of all, Moses is sort of the the pattern of the prophet for the Old Testament. Now, I know you might think to yourself, wait a minute, the prophets are in a different part of the Bible, but Moses is I mean, there are other people in Genesis who could be said to be prophets, but Moses is sort of the first Israelite prophet, the great prophet. And the the prophets after him are a pattern on his life. So a couple things about that. First of all, his will collides with God at the burning bush, and we see this in the prophets that many times their desires collide with God's desires, but God seems to win every time. Whether it's through manifesting himself in a burning bush, whether it's through swallowing Jonah in the belly of the whale, the prophets are made to do what God wants them to do. And that's why they're prophets, because ultimately they obey God. Interestingly, at the burning bush, God manifests his presence to the prophet. But when Christ comes, he is the prophet and he is the manifestation of God's presence. Both at the same time. Another thing to mention here is that the tribulation, this sign of judgment, the plagues that God sends, 10 plagues, these are signs of his judgment on Egypt, on oppressing God's people, on their sin. They are also signs of his rule over the cosmic order. Yahweh is in charge of everything that happens cosmically. We see this at Jesus' death. We see darkness, the 9th plague, and then we see the death of the firstborn son, the 10th plague, in Jesus' death. And then you get earthquakes and temple veil tearing in two and all the rest of it. So God demonstrates his sovereignty, his rule over the created order in these plagues. So a number of things that are important here about this story, but namely that the Exodus is the Old Testament pattern. So God's people are rescued by the blood of the Lamb, and it's through the judgment of the firstborn son, namely through death. That's the culmination of these tribulation judgments. In that happening, in the death of the firstborn son, the blood of the Lamb, culminating the judgments, God's people are freed. And in being freed, they flee from their oppressors and cross through the waters of the Red Sea. In salvation, wrought by Jesus, God's people are freed from bondage by being covered in the blood of the Lamb through the death of the firstborn son. Which is both judgment on the nations and salvation for us. And then those who believe flee from their oppressor, Satan and sin, and go through the waters of baptism. The Exodus is the model of salvation. We see in its narrative picture what Christ does in us. So, as you think about the Exodus, as you read the Exodus story, this is not just a great story of God's power, although it certainly is. It is a story that models salvation for us. Of course, when the Israelites get out, it's interesting. When they get out, they begin to grumble and complain immediately. First they say, wait a minute. When they get to the edge of the water, they say, wait a minute. What did you do, Moses? We're all going to die here because Pharaoh's coming right at them and they have nowhere to go. So they don't believe. They've just seen God do 10 signs and they still don't believe. They get to the edge of the water and they think, we're done for. So God parts the water, they go through, Pharaoh's army is drowned. after the Israelites get through and God puts the waters back in place. And then they keep complaining. So they complain about food, they complain about water, complain. And what we see when they complain is that God starts to give them rules. And this is important because it's not just when we get to what we think about as the law. I guess that doesn't make sense. I'm pointing at my screen there, by the way. When we get to what we know as the law in Exodus 20, it doesn't come out of thin air. It's in response to a progression of sin in the nation of Israel. And in fact, even Exodus 19 and 20 and the golden calf incident in Exodus 32 through 34, a number of other places in the middle of the law narrative, Israel keeps sinning. And as they keep sinning, God keeps giving them more law. So the pattern that we see is more sin, more law. God starts in Exodus 16, 17, 18. After they complain, he gives them rules and statutes that we aren't told what they are, but he gives them to them. In Exodus 19, there appears to be some hesitancy, some reticence about ascending the mountain like God told them to do, and he gives them the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. The Ten Commandments are in Exodus 20. And then, because they refuse to go up the mountain, God gives them the tabernacle laws. And the tabernacle laws are laws that are provided to give God a place to dwell with his people because they wouldn't come up on the mountain with him to dwell with him. So, and that's really the first part of the law until we get to Exodus 32. So these tabernacle laws are put in place because Israel won't believe and go up the mountain. It's more sin, more law. Because after the tabernacle laws are given, then the golden calf incident happens, and then God just says, all right, boom. And from Exodus 35 through Numbers 10, it's all over. That's all law. God says, you can't obey. I'm going to give you this law, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. But you can't obey. I'm going to give you this law. And it was for the purpose of giving them a detailed written instruction on how to have a relationship with God. Because obviously they couldn't do it themselves. They kept disobeying. It never was a... Well, we'll talk about this in a minute. So here's a diagram of the tabernacle. That's for your information. The entrance is cut off down here. It's below your slide right here. So if you just go straight from the altar, burn off, and down this way, the entrance is right there. We're not going to go over the details here. There are some fascinating parallels between the layout of the tabernacle and then later the temple, and then the way that Jesus interacts with the temple in the Gospels, but we're not going to go into that right now. Obviously, the veil is torn at the crucifixion, taking down the wall between God and man. Hebrews says we're now able to enter into the most holy place, which the high priest was only able to enter once a year because of Jesus' blood. All this sort of thing. So there's all kinds of fascinating things we could talk about with parallels between the tabernacle and the ministry of Jesus and in the nature of the church. But we won't go into all that right now. This is just provided for you just to give you a reference point for what the tabernacle looked like. Again, this is given so that Israel would know how to dwell with God, have a place to dwell with God. And, it's important for us to know that this is not the way that God dwells with his people today. He dwells with them by the power of the Spirit. Christ has come. Christ is the manifestation of God in the flesh. John 1:14, God came and tabernacled among us. So the tabernacle and the temple are no longer needed. Jesus is the tabernacle. Jesus is the temple. And although he is bodily in heaven at the right hand of the Father, he dwells with us now by his Spirit. So this is no longer the way that God dwells with his people. It's by his Spirit. So how do we view the law as Christians? Two texts that I think we need to think about are Matthew 5:17 through 20, and then Galatians 3:1 through 29. Let me just turn to both of those. So first, Matthew 5 says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So this is a very positive view of the law by Jesus. And he says, "I didn't come to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill it." Let's read also Galatians 3. I may not, we're getting long in the tooth here on our lecture time, so I may not read this entire chapter. Let's start in verse 19 in Galatians 3. It says, "Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made, and it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. Now an intermediary implies more than one, but God is one. Is the law then contrary to the promises of God? Certainly not. For if a law had been given that could give life, then righteousness would indeed be by the law. But the Scripture imprisoned everything under sin, so that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. Now before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise." Now, there's a few things that Paul says here. The first thing we want to say is that neither Paul nor Jesus says the law is obsolete, the law doesn't matter anymore, the law is terrible, the law is bad, Christians don't have to obey any of it. Neither of them say that. Jesus is a very positive statement about the law in Matthew 5. I think what we see in Paul, though, is Jesus fleshing out what Jesus means by not abolishing but fulfilling it. A few things here. So, first of all, in verse 19, "Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions." Okay, we already saw this in the narrative pattern. The narrative pattern of the Pentateuch is more sin, more law. The more sin that happens, the more law that happens. The second thing that we see here is that the law does not give life. Verse 21, "If a law had been given that could give life, then righteousness would indeed be by the law." The law never saved anybody. Obeying the law never was the means to righteousness. Obeying the law was never the means to restoration with God. Obeying the law was a response to God's work in our hearts. Obedience still is a work that is a response to God's salvation of us in Christ. So the law never saved anybody. Obeying the law never saved anybody. The law was meant to do a couple of things. Paul mentions this third thing that I want to mention here in this passage in verse. Hands are too big. Verse 24, "The law was our guardian." The law was given as a teacher to show us that we are sinners, and the law was given as a guardian to guard the nation of Israel from being totally depraved, utterly depraved, until Christ came. Because if they had, if there was no remnant of Israel that obeyed the law, or that, I guess I should say, that was saved by Yahweh and that therefore obeyed the law, if there had not been people who were obedient, and if Israel had just been left to their own devices, even really, they would have been so sinful that Yahweh would have been forced to destroy them, because they would have been such a stink in his nostrils. But God made a promise to them, a covenant with them, and he gave them the law so that he, in part, so that he would not have to destroy them. And so the law shows us that we're sinners, and it guarded Israel from being destroyed until Christ came, when salvation came for all people. So that's what the law did. Something that's not in Galatians 3. Couple things. The law does give us a picture of who God is. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the law really distinguished Israel from the nations. It distinguished Israel from the nations, and they only were allowed to worship one God, only God. It distinguished Israel from the nations in their ethical practices, in their civic practices, in their ceremonial practices. It showed the nations that Israel was different. And Israel is different because their God is different. Their God is the only true God. There is no other God but Yahweh. And so the law also shows us who God is. Now, I don't want you to hear by that the law is an ideal. It's not. Many of the laws in the Mosaic Law are not intended to be idealistic. They're not, so when it talks about human slavery, that doesn't mean it's condoning slavery. We need to remember that the law was given as a guardian and as a schoolmaster to Israel. And so there is a sense in which the law shows us who God is, because it shows us that he cares about his creation, he cares about how we treat each other, he cares about how we worship him. There's also a sense in which God is accommodating the laws to the nation of Israel because he knows how sinful they are and he's trying to check their sin. So when we see laws about human slavery, it's not as if God is condoning it. It's, I know that this is a reality in Israel, and here's how we can at least minimize the damage, kind of thing. Okay, so the law is never meant to save anybody. You don't get saved by obeying the law. The law is intended as a schoolmaster and as a guardian. And we can see sort of through a glass darkly who God is in the law, but we also know that the law is temporary. It's to mark Israel off from the nations. And once Christ comes, the people of God's relationship to the law changes. All right. We're 43 minutes in, so let's take a pause moment. And I want you to think about how you thought about the law previously. And then maybe anything that struck you in what I've said and how that might change your attitude about the law going forward. All right, so just think about that for a minute. Okay, so we've discussed the law, we've discussed the tabernacle, how it points to Christ. We've discussed how Christians, Jesus doesn't abolish the law, but he fulfills it, so Christians don't just write it off. There's still good things that we can learn from the law, namely, like we talked about just a minute ago, how we can learn who God is. And there are still precepts that are viable for us today. That doesn't mean we have to obey the law. We can wear polyester, or don't wear polyester, but we can wear blended clothing. We can use dishes for both dairy and meat. We can do all sorts of things that the law talks about and prohibits because we are not the nation of Israel. The people of God is now a global people, a multi-ethnic people, and the way that we are distinguished from the nations is by the fruit of the Spirit, not the rules of the law. So we've discussed the law. Now we're going to jump into Leviticus, which is just a bunch of law. my PowerPoint work. There we go. Move my video down again, just so, there we go. Leviticus is mostly about sacrifices. So with the tabernacle laws in Exodus 19 through 31, you're dealing with dwelling with God, how to approach God in his dwelling place. This is where you get the language about what the priests wear, how the tabernacle is to be set up, this sort of thing. Starting with Exodus 35, though, it's an issue of how to deal with sin. And Leviticus is particularly about how to deal with sin, sacrifices for sin. Sacrifices weren't just for sin. I mean, you had a Thanksgiving offering, praise offering, these sorts of things, whole burnt offerings. These were not for sin, but much of the sacrificial system is intended to deal with the separation between God and man because of sin. All of the ancient Near Eastern cultures sacrificed, but Israel was different. Animals weren't sacrificed for clairvoyance to try to tell the future. Sacrifices were linked to a covenant relationship with God, so Israel wasn't sacrificing to try to gain God's favor or get him to do stuff for them. They were sacrificing because he has already saved them from bondage in Egypt, and this is their response. And the concept of the holiness of God is at the center, not the needs of man. And so the holiness of God is there, so there's praise of God, thanksgiving to God for his gifts, whole burnt offering is a way to say we're dedicated to you, God. And then the sin offerings, for the purpose of restoring sinful man to a holy God. Now, when I say that, I don't mean to say that sacrifices ever saved anybody. They didn't. Salvation has always been by grace through faith. What saved an individual Israelite was faith, just like what saves an individual person now is faith in the Messiah. But Israel, by sacrificing, was demonstrating their faith. Some people obviously did these sacrifices, much like today people go to church and say they're Christians and they're really not. Some people did the sacrifices, a lot of people did the sacrifices and didn't have faith. Nevertheless, for those who did have faith, who hoped for the Messiah, this was a means of demonstrating their commitment to the Lord and their faith in him. Here's an outline of the book. The Holiness Code is particularly important. This is where we get the clean and unclean laws, the laws about discharges and touching dead bodies and all the rest of it. And what we want to say about those laws, the laws that really, those are some of the laws where we're like, wait a minute, how in the world would this apply to a Christian today? Because it's kind of easy to say, all right, here are the offerings, here are the sacrifices. Well, Jesus is our sacrifice. Here's the priesthood. Here's the laws about the priesthood. Jesus is our high priest. And then we get to clean and unclean and the holiness code, and we think about what God says to Peter in Acts 10, and we're like, wait a minute. Okay, this is where we get confused. How do these apply to Christians today? And the answer to that is what I said just a minute ago, which is that in the Old Testament, Israel, the people of God in the Old Testament, is a ethnic, geopolitical nation, and God's covenant with them, the Mosaic covenant, is temporary. It's set in place, like Paul says, until the Messiah comes. And so these laws about cleanliness and uncleanliness, about being holy, in particular ways, like don't sow the same kinds of seed in the same, or don't sow different kinds of seed in the same field, that sort of thing. These laws are intended to separate them from the nations. They're intended to, and again, they're intended to guard Israel until the Messiah comes. Now, both of those functions are no longer operative. The first one, the distinguish Israel from the nations, Christians are distinguished from the nations not by being a separate nation with separate dress, codes of conduct, these sorts of things, but by the fruits of the Spirit. So if you think about a circle around the people of God that separates them from other peoples, in the Old Testament for the nation of Israel, that was the law. In the New Testament for Christians, it's the fruit of the Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit. And the other thing about it is the law no longer guards the nations, or the nation of Israel, because Jesus is the true Israel. He has fulfilled the law, and he now brings the nations, including Israel, to himself. So the one people of God is made up of many nations. The function of the geopolitical nation of Israel, which was to bring the Messiah, has been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. He is the true Israel. He is the fulfillment of Israel's hopes. And now those who are in him are in Israel. And so that function of guarding the nation until the Messiah comes is done. It's no longer a need. And so the way this applies to us is not by going here and saying, well, I don't have to obey any of that, but by saying God expects his people to be distinct from the nations. God expects his people to be different, to be marked off. In the Old Testament, it's in the cleanliness and uncleanliness laws, in the holiness code. In the New Testament, it's by the fruits of the Spirit. These are some of the things that are included in the holiness code. These would be good for you to remember. Again, all of them are attempting to do one thing, which is distinguish Israel from the nations. And like I said, that function is accomplished by the fruits of the Spirit today. You also might want to know the different types of sacrifices in the first few chapters of Leviticus. For instance, it might be good for you to know that the least common sacrifice is the guilt offering. It also might be good for you to know that peace offerings have three different subtypes: thanksgiving, vowed, and free will offering. Let me make sure there's nothing else that you might want to know. Yep, so of those, let me just go through these here. Of those aspects that I gave you about what was distinctive, the most distinctive aspect is that it's linked to the covenantal relationship with God. You also might want to know that the Levites were in charge of, as the name Leviticus indicates, the Levites were in charge of the priesthood. They were the tribe where the priest came from. They are not descended from Judah, as their name indicates. They are descended from Levi, who was a son of Jacob. You probably want to know that the holiness code is about laws outside of the tabernacle. So you remember at the beginning of this, we talked about the fact that the tabernacle laws were given, and then dealing with sin, laws dealing with sin was given mainly in Leviticus. Those sacrifices and the laws about the priesthood are also dealing with the tabernacle because they happen inside the tabernacle. The holiness code and the cleanliness and uncleanliness laws are about life outside the tabernacle. And so with those laws we get an indication of what life for Israel was supposed to be like outside of the tabernacle. The law up to that point was mainly dealing with inside the tabernacle. Let's talk a little bit about the Day of Atonement, because this was the height of the sacrificial system. So let's go back here for just a minute to the offerings. We actually get the Day of Atonement laws here. And when we talk about Day of Atonement, we're basically talking about a ceremony once a year where sin was supposed to be purged from the nation. And what happened was the high priest would wash himself ceremonially, and then he would take one goat called the scapegoat and lay his hands on it, and it was symbolically putting all of the sins of Israel onto this scapegoat, and he sent it out in the wilderness. And then he would take a lamb, a spotless lamb, inside into the Holy of Holies and sacrifice it for the nation of Israel for sins. And none of this is unique in terms of sacrificing for sin, except for the fact that a scapegoat was required and a lamb, going into the Holy of Holies was required. The high priest actually would tie a rope around himself and walk in because he didn't want to die. Well, if he died, they needed to drag him out. They couldn't go in because they would die too. Because approaching the holy God is so important and how you do it. And so what's happening is God ordains sacrificial blood for the cleansing of sin. And the principle that's determined there is that life has to be given to atone for sin. Obviously, there's huge parallels with Christ here. Christ is the spotless Lamb. Christ goes into the Holy of Holies for us. Christ dies the death that pays the penalty for sin. The difference is the Day of Atonement was just for the nation of Israel. Christ's sacrifice is for the whole world. So obviously that's a big difference between those two. But the Day of Atonement is a big part of Leviticus, an important part of Leviticus. And you hear the language about the lamb's blood and this sort of thing. And it also harkens back to Exodus again with the lamb covering up sin. So many important parallels to Christ with Leviticus as well. All right, let's move into Numbers, and let's take another pause a moment. I'm going to try to go through Numbers and Deuteronomy very quickly because we are really hurting on time. So take a pause moment, catch your breath, and then we will resume with Numbers and Deuteronomy. Next, we want to talk about Numbers and Deuteronomy. And again, I'm going to try to see if I can get this. There we go. Talked about these. I'm going to see if I can go fairly quickly through this because we're almost at an hour on this lecture. We'll see how it goes. We may do Former Prophets next week. If the video for Former Prophets is posted in week 4, then that's when you should watch it. I mean, the syllabus will have all this. But since we're getting so long, we may do that next week. We'll see. All right, so Numbers. They are still at Sinai at the beginning of Numbers. So chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 10, they are still at Sinai. They're still receiving law through chapter 5, I believe, and then they start to get ready to move because they're wandering in the desert in Numbers. And you see here the geographical organization of the book. This book is organized geographically. So they start at Sinai, then they move from Sinai to Edom, and from Edom to the Jordan. So this is part of their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. This is their 40 years of wandering. This is when it happens. And you see the geographical locations where they wander to and from. Basically, the front and back of the book are preparations to leave. The first preparation to leave is to leave the mountain, which is chapter 1 through chapter 10. And then at the end of the book, chapter 20 through chapter 36 is preparing to enter Canaan. So they're marshaling, they're organizing the tribes, this sort of thing, and then in the middle they're wandering around. So you see the beginning chapters, this is sort of a breakdown of what they're doing. They're organizing the tribes around the tabernacle. They're talking about treatment of those who defile the camp. They're reminded of the importance of dedication and faithfulness to God, and then they're instructed on moving the tabernacle and how to depart. As we'll see when you read 1 Samuel, these are important because as the ark is being brought by David to Obed-Edom in 2 Samuel, they carry it incorrectly. David has them carry it incorrectly to try to get there faster, and somebody tries to catch it when it lurches, and they die. So these things are important. They happen. They play a role in what happens to Israel later on. So Numbers 10 is the end of a continuous stream of law that began in Exodus 20. And we already talked about the fact that it's more sin, more law. That's sort of the narrative pattern of the Pentateuch. More sin. The more sin there is, the more law that's given. And the fundamental problem that we see because of that narrative pattern is that Israel cannot obey. And this only gets worse in Numbers. It starts with the grumbling after the Red Sea, then the golden calf incident, and then you get all the provisions of Leviticus. And in Numbers, only Caleb and Joshua obey out of the first generation of Israel. Numbers 14:24. Let me just move this here for just a minute. Numbers 14:24 says that Caleb had a different spirit. Just sort of think about Christian theology. What do we need to obey as Christians? The Spirit. Caleb had a different spirit, so that he did obey. And apparently Joshua did as well. So the problem with Israel is that they can't obey, and in Numbers it just gets worse. Starting with the spies, and then you have the rebellion at Kadesh. You have all kinds of incidents in Numbers where Israel just doesn't obey. And this problem governs the preparation of entering the land in Numbers 20 and then moving through Deuteronomy, and also the narrative of the Deuteronomistic history, because what we see in Deuteronomy, at the end of Numbers and then in Deuteronomy, is Moses warning the people to obey, because otherwise curses are going to come down on them. And what we see in Joshua through Kings is that they don't obey, and curses do come down on them. And so really from Adam, obedience is impossible. So at the end of Numbers, in Numbers 20 through 36, they're at the Jordan, and they start to receive instructions about preparation to enter the Promised Land. And Deuteronomy is a continuation of this preparation, and what it really is a recap of everything that has happened so far. What Moses does is retells the story, tells Israel what they've done, how God saved them out of Egypt, but then they disobeyed, and he recounts, sort of these highlights of disobedience in both Exodus and in Numbers. And he says, you're about to enter the Promised Land. This is the covenant that God made with you. All of your ancestors are dead. All of your parents are dead because you wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. Now you're a new generation. Now let me remind you, God has made a covenant with you. You need to obey, and if you don't, here are the consequences. That's essentially what Deuteronomy is. It is related to what's called a Hittite suzerainty covenant, or a suzerainty treaty. And in those, what happens is the conquering king will lay out provisions for how to relate to him, to his conquered people. And this is sort of what Yahweh does. He says, I've conquered you in the Exodus. You're my people. Here's how to live with me. And so in Deuteronomy, you have a preamble, a historical prologue. You have stipulations of the covenant. You have a provision for how to store the laws and how to read them. Then you have a list of, in the Hittite religion, you have a list of the gods as witnesses. In Deuteronomy, it's heaven and earth that are witnesses. And then you have curses and blessings. What's going to happen if you do obey and if you don't obey. Deuteronomy is unlike the ancient Near East in that it is monotheistic. Everybody else was polytheistic. They believed in many gods. And so you see sort of the basic outline that we just saw in the suzerainty treaty is emulated here in the outline of Deuteronomy. You have a historical prologue right here. You have covenant stipulations. You have sanctions, including how to store the laws, when to read them, and curses and blessings, and then you have sort of the ending of the book in Deuteronomy 32 through 34. Deuteronomy, sorry I'm having to move this so much, y'all. Deuteronomy means second law, but it really is the second giving of the law. It's not another law or a different law. But it's preparation for this second generation of Israel to enter the land. And so in chapters 1 through 3, like I said, Moses summarizes Exodus through Numbers. And in doing so, I'm going to have to rethink this video placement. In doing so, what he does is he's drawing on a number of things that he's already written. Namely, first of all, the Abrahamic covenant. So when he tells Israel to go and take the land, and when he tells them they're going to be multiplied more than the stars of heaven, he is echoing Genesis 1 and Genesis 15. He's saying, look, when you're going into the land, this is a new Adam, new Abraham situation. The promises to them, the covenant with Abraham, the expectations of Adam are about to be fulfilled in you as you enter the promised land if you obey. The second thing that it does is it reminds them of the past, namely of those two narrative threads we talked about. First of all, God's salvation of his people through the seed, and then, namely the Exodus event, and also the failure of Israel to obey. So the promise of God to save people and the inability of human beings to obey are both reminded of by Moses here. And so basically what Deuteronomy is doing is saying, look, here's a summary of what's happened so far. Here's what's about to happen. And the context of both of those things is restoring what Adam lost through Abraham, because God wants to save his people, but his people can't obey. That's the basic building block. Those four things are the basic building blocks of the Pentateuch. Restoring what Adam lost through the Abrahamic covenant, because God is a God who saves, but humanity can't save themselves. They can't obey. Those four blocks are the building blocks of the entire Old Testament and of the Pentateuch, particularly here. In chapters 4 through 11, he gives them sort of a vision of the kingdom where, the basic summation is love God and love neighbor. And in the rest of the book, he gives laws concerning how to go into the land, how to choose a king when that time comes, where to go into the land, how to deal with the people there. And he says, look, this is because you didn't go up the mountain, and you didn't go into the land. You instead wandered in the wilderness. The spies went in numbers and came out and said there's too many giants there, other than Caleb and Joshua. And the people said, we're not going in. And so God says, all right, you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. That's the book of Numbers. So, again, more sin, more law. There's more laws here in chapters 12 through 27. And then he says, here's what's going to happen good for you if you obey. Here are the curses that are going to happen to you if you don't obey. Israel is going to fail. Moses makes this clear in chapter 30, 17, and 18. He says, you're not going to be able to do this. And that's what happens. Israel doesn't obey. And then finally, in chapters 31 through 34, we get the story of Joshua's succession, where we have a promise and an expectation of a prophet like Moses in chapter 18. And you have Joshua succeeding Moses in chapter 34. But Joshua isn't it. He is not the prophet like Moses. What Deuteronomy's expectation is that a new prophet like Moses will come and lead Israel into the land, help them to conquer their enemies, and establish God's kingdom. Moses doesn't do it, and Joshua doesn't do it. And later on we'll see David doesn't do it, Solomon doesn't do it. Nobody does it until Jesus. Jesus is the prophet like Moses. So some Christological impacts here. First of all, Christ succeeds where Israel fails. In Matthew 4, the temptations that Jesus experiences, his replies are all from Deuteronomy, and they are all indications that Jesus succeeds where Israel fails. Secondly, Christ takes the curse for us. Anyone who is hanged on a tree is cursed in Deuteronomy 21. Jesus is cursed by hanging on a tree in Galatians 3. He takes the curse for us. In terms of the blessings and curses, we can't obey, so we are cursed. But Christ obeys for us, so in him we're blessed. Christ is the greater Moses, so he's a prophet like Moses. On the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus is greater than both the great prophets of the Old Testament, Elijah and Moses. And in chapter 34, we see a scene. We'll talk more. We already talked about those in Joshua 1, Psalm 1, Malachi 3. The whole Old Testament, every part of it is looking for this prophet greater than Moses, this wise king who will come and lead his nation out of bondage. This is what the entire Old Testament is looking for, and it's what's found in Christ. So as you think about the Pentateuch, what I want you to hear is those four threads. God is about saving his people who cannot save themselves. He wants to restore what was lost by Adam through Abraham. That's basically the Pentateuch in a nutshell. Israel continues to disobey. God continues to save and to promise to save. Israel disobeys like Adam. God saves through Abraham, Adam's seed. I mean, it's very basic. I mean, it's very easy. We look at the Old Testament and we think, what is going on? But that's the basics. Those are the basic building blocks right there. And so as you think about the Pentateuch, think about the great truths that are found there in the narrative, that we are all great sinners, but Christ is a great Savior.